Very interested to hear about your research, what you've been doing.
So I'm interested in plant insect interactions. That's one part of the work I do, but the study that we'll talk about today is the ecological study, so looking at the invertebrates that live in Gardeners Creek Reserve. That's a major thing that we're working on this year.
And how did you go about discovering there was a need for that research?
Well, there's just very little published work about any sort of invertebrate, particularly insect studies in urban environments. There's lots published about pristine environments, but urban environments tend to be understudied and perhaps undervalued.
Is that important to have that research out there?
It is important. The more we know, the more sort of things we can find out about our environment, particularly now when we need to manage the environment a lot more closely than we used to, because it's being changed by human impact. And if you don't know what's there, you don't know how things are changing. So what we're doing is providing a baseline study, so looking at what the invertebrates that are in two different types of habitats, comparing the abundance and also the diversity. And it's also a temporal study, so we're repeating over a number of years.
So conducting the research, what was the first thing that you really had to do to get this into motion?
Well, the first thing to do is come up with a hypothesis or a research question. So why study the invertebrates in two different areas in an urban environment? So you'd have to come up with some sort of hypothesis that perhaps there's more invertebrates in the leafy habitat than in the grass habitat. So that was one of the initial ideas, and then just to have a baseline set of data so that we can build on in the future. And the first thing to do, once you've got your research question, if you're interested and you've got lots of people interested too, you need to go and present to the council or whoever manages the land before you go out digging holes or collecting litter. So that getting permission is very important too before you start a study.
So that's a real issue when you're going out into the field, just to make sure that you're, not getting into trouble or trespassing or things like that.
That's right, particularly if you're working in parks, in national or state parks, you have to have permission to both trap invertebrates and also to do any sort of scientific research in a national or state park if you want to publish your data. And you certainly, if you go out to the trouble of collecting data, and it's really interesting, you want to make sure that people know what's going on.
So before you went out into the field, what were some of the plans that you put forward to get ready?
Well, the first thing to do is coming up with the research question, and once you've got that sorted out, then you have to think about the statistics you're going to apply at the end. So you have to have some idea of how you're going to collect the data. You don't know what you're going to find out, but you do need to have an idea of the statistical tests you're going to use. Then you need to try and find a suitable area, so you use Google Maps and then go out and see exactly what the environment looks like, because what's on Google Maps isn't the most up to date and things could have changed. So you need to do that. You need to collect information about the habitat, so look at the vegetation, the substrate, and if you can, use data loggers for temperature and humidity, and the two different types of environments. So make sure you've got everything planned, decide where you're going to have the pitfall traps, record all the coordinates, take lots of photos of the sites so that in the future you can go back to the same sites. You put up flagging tape, which is sort of neon pink or orange, but chances are they'll be removed during the year, so you really have to have good records of where you put out the initial traps so that you can repeat the study next year to see if there's been any changes.
And recording the data, how did you record the data that you collected?
The invertebrate data,
Yeah.
So the pitfall traps were put out and left in position for 3 weeks, then went back and collected all the tubes and kept them all separate because you like to have replicates to make sure you get a representative of the populations that are in an area. Then all the invertebrates had to be sorted out of the leaf litter and all the other things that had fallen into pitfall traps and then identified. And for some invertebrates, it's quite easy to get to their family or even their species, but for others, you have to have a reference collection. And in Australia, there's so little work done on many invertebrates, and the insects in particular, that you can only get to what's called morphospecies. So you have a collection of all the morphospecies. We do like to give things proper names in science, but because there's so much that hasn't been done, you just have to go by the shape, so the morphospecies, and have a reference collection so they can go back, and it's easier the next time you sort.
And did you discover anything exciting with your data over this short space of time thus far?
Well, we're just amazed at the diversity of invertebrates that were in Gardeners Creek Reserve because it's quite impacted by foot traffic, dogs, humans. Some of the things that we did find were we found a species of ant that hadn't been recorded in Victoria before, particularly in the colder months. And also there was a fantastic spider, the ladybird spider, that was black with red spots that hadn't been described before. So we were able to send that off to an arachnid taxonomist who was going to name it and formally describe it. Just the diversity and the numbers of invertebrates we found were just amazing in just a small area.
And why is that important to find out what bugs are living in an urban environment?
Well, it's very important to know what's there to begin with so that if any management decisions are going to be made, you need to, they're near the bottom of food chains. So if you remove some of those invertebrates, that's going to impact other species higher up on the food chain. So you have to know what's there before you make any management changes to an area, particularly in urban environments. There's going to be a lot of changes over time. So it's much better if you know what's there and potentially know how it's going to be impacted if there's going to be any change in perhaps things like the mowing regime or removing trees, which has been done in many parks.
So who would you like to see use your data, use your research?
Well, I think in this case it would be the local council will be interested in having a look at that. Well, they were very interested in knowing what was there and whether their revegetation of parts of Gardeners Creek Reserve, they'll be able to see whether it has any impact in the future. They've started to make some positive changes there. They've fenced off some areas to stop all the plants being trampled and dogs running over the top and people walking on things. So it'll be very interesting to see whether there is any positive change or whether there's going to be change in the populations of invertebrates that are there. Because to have a healthy environment, you need to have diversity. It's no good just having one or two species because you find that eventually the ecosystem will break down.
There can be a challenge sometimes to inform other people about the research that you've done who aren't familiar with science. Are there ways that you've presented data that has helped people to understand the science better?
Yes, well, just presenting a huge table with lots and lots of numbers is not going to mean very much to people that are not scientists. So you have to think about ways to represent that data and present it to a target audience that make it easy for them to understand. So some of the ways of doing that are rather than having a huge data set in an enormous table, is to have summary data, or perhaps to graph some of that data, some of the more important aspects. So maybe some of the most abundant groups of invertebrates that you found. One of the student teams created graphs where they had a small image of the most abundant of the invertebrates. So it was easy for people to see exactly what they were talking about, rather than thinking, oh yes, well that's a really long and complicated name and I've got no idea what it is. And to use common names too, that makes it more accessible to people, because you want people to make use of and understand what you're talking about, rather than sitting there and thinking, well this is all very well, but what are we going to do with it? So you have to try and convey how important it is to know what's there, so that they can manage the environment better.
And are there challenges compared to doing science within a laboratory like we're in now to being out in the field?
Yes, well, one of the major challenges, I think, to environmental work is the weather. The weather can flood all your pitfall traps, can cause all sorts of changes, and some of the things that students learnt last year when they went out and set up their pitfall traps is they didn't realise that they had their traps at the bottom of the incline. So we had a major rainfall event. They had to rush out at the weekend and pick up all their pitfall traps because they were starting to get flooded. Other things, if you work in urban areas in particular, is vandalism. Whether it's deliberate, or people or dogs accidentally tread on your traps or pick them out to see what they are and think, oh, I'm not sure what this is, so they throw them away. And what they don't realise is that's 3 weeks of data that they've just thrown away. So you have to be a little bit careful about where you position your pitfall traps, not to use really bright colours for some of the markers to show where the pitfall traps are actually in the ground, and to try and have them blend in a little bit so that they're not attractive to people that are walking past. But the weather, perhaps, I think is the variable you really can't control. So you have to have contingency plans. If you plan to go out on a particular day and it starts to rain, very disappointing, but you just have to change your plans and go out when it's a bit warmer.
Would you have any other advice for the budding field scientists when they're going out into the field, what they should look out for?
Well, you really have to keep very good records. Always take a camera or your phone, take photos of the site so they can go back to exactly the same spot. And you never know what you're going to see. You might think, oh, well, it's an urban park, there's nothing very interesting there, but it could just be the scale of things you're looking for are too big. Everybody looks for warm and furry animals, and birds are really obvious. But some of the smaller animals that you'd see there, it's really good to have your camera so you can photograph them. And just keep very good records. Take your field book out, use your field notebook to note down anything that you notice, any changes in the environment, anything that happens that you find unusual. It's never wasted. Anything that you record is really can be very valuable. Well, apart from good records, coordinates of all your different sites, make sure you have all your replicates labelled. Labelling is very important. No good doing a fantastic study and then finding out that you've got 100 different tubes and all the labels have washed off, because you're not going to be able to do anything with that. You can't even sort it. If you don't know which particular area the invertebrates were trapped from, you're not going to be able to do anything with it. So that's very, very important, as well as keeping good field notes.
So it sounds like preparation and being meticulous and also trying to work out what could go wrong is really important with undertaking field studies.
It certainly is. There are some things that are just totally uncontrollable, like the weather, but do as much planning as you possibly can. Have all the tubes pre-labelled if you possibly can. Make sure if you're using ethanol that you don't use some sort of marker that will wash off. All those sort of things that can easily happen, and you just have to make sure that you have everything ready to go and to be able to change at the last minute if the weather changes.
Looking further afield, getting information to help with your own research, is there other resources that people can go to?
There's resources like the CSIRO entomology website that has fantastic invertebrate keys. They're online keys. There's also a manual for collection techniques for invertebrates, so anybody that's interested can just go online and have a look at all the different techniques that are really well documented and have been used for many years, so you can compare what you collect with many other scientists.
The science can just stay in a lab or stay in a logbook. Is there other ways that students could present their knowledge?
Well, the most important thing is to do something with that knowledge. Not much point in just leaving it in the lab. You really need to either have it published, whether it's in the print media, or have it online for other people, so that other people can perhaps build on your data and send you data or information that you can put together and build a bigger picture. So you could end up doing biogeography of a particular region. That one particular group, it's too big a task, but if you have a number of people using exactly the same method, then all the data is comparable, and you can end up with a very large data set that can tell you a lot about a whole area, like a whole continent if possible.
So even someone putting their data up on a blog and describing their field experience, would you find that valuable?
That would be really valuable, particularly things, it's fine to have all the things that work out really well, but it's always really good to be able to inform people and warn them about things that you found out, whether you've used a particular type of marker and the label is worn off, or whether you have to be careful of particular areas where you could have increased vandalism, things that you haven't really thought of before. We have had birds steal things from the pitfall traps, so areas where there are lots of birds, that can sometimes be a problem. And putting all that sort of information is really useful for others if they're planning to do a study in a similar type of area.
And do you have a bigger picture sort of vision for the research that you're conducting?
Well, I suppose my research area, as well as the ecology, urban ecology, it's really taxonomy. So my major interest is really naming new species. So doing any of these studies, there are just so many insects in particular that haven't ever been formally described and named. That's really, I find that really exciting, to be able to describe things morphologically, or their shape and size, and also to do their DNA profile and give them a name. I really like giving insects names, new insects names, really exciting.
And can you think of a moment where you really knew in yourself that you wanted to be a scientist, you wanted to find out more about the world?
I think I've always really liked insects in particular, just their symmetry, the colours, the different forms, the types of wings they have, and just that they're the Earth's survivors. They'll be here long after humans. If anything ever goes wrong, there'll be lots of invertebrates here, insects in particular. When you think cockroaches can survive being in a microwave, and they're supposed to be the only animals that will be able to survive something like a nuclear explosion. So I think they're just Earth's survivors.
And can you come up with anything that for the new field scientists, just a little bit of inspiration about getting involved with science?
I think science, there's just so many different areas in science. The main thing you need to have is curiosity, to be really observant, to make sure you note what you find. And there's always lots of exciting things, even in your own backyard. You can find new species that have never been described before. People think you need to go to big, pristine forests, but there's many, many insects in particular that have never been named. There's lots of exciting things to do. There's just too many for the small number of people that work on them at the moment.
Thank you very much for chatting with us. Is there a way that people can find out more about your research and what you're doing?
I suppose the best way would be to look at the Deakin website. We have, within our School of Life and Environmental Sciences, every staff member has some information about their research and their latest publications.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you.